Привit moi druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gertis. I'm a professor who is trying to provide context for you in the war in Ukraine and help you understand what's going on. Some time ago, I did this video where I was looking at Scott Ritter. Now, if you don't know who Scott Ritter is, Scott Ritter and Douglas Macgregor and a few others are like the leading repeaters of Russian propaganda from the military perspective. Scott Ritter and Judge Napolitano were talking today. I'm going to show you one where Scott Ritter is being interviewed by this guy named Stephen Gardner. Now, Stephen Gardner, so I think he's somewhat conservative or Republicanish or something like that. I am too. Look, I was wearing this before I even decided to shoot, this video, but I'm not like that. I'm a Reagan conservative. And a Reagan conservative, old classical conservative, sees what Russia is doing and says, no, 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 the Russians are liars. This shall not stand. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Remember all those kind of things? So this is not the same kind of Republican. But these guys somehow drunk some kind of Kool-Aid that I don't quite understand. I tried to unpack it in another video, and you can go back and look at that. But this guy, Stephen Gardner, has 1.26 million subscribers. Now, he's in this video that we're about to see, you're going to see Scott Ritter repeating lie after lie again, and it's really unbelievable. The title, it has 23 hours ago, it has 213 views. Scott Ritter says Ukraine's in major trouble right now. 22 hours, 213,000 views. Imagine that. So let's watch this video and see what we can see.
Hey, I'm Joey, and I'm one of the 30 AI voices from Speechlock. You listened to this video until now and you probably couldn't tell I'm not a real human voice. That's because I understand exactly what each phrase is saying, and I know how to put inflections in my voice, just like a real human would do. With speech...
Alright, I have with me today Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and Marine. Today we're going to be talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to be talking about China inserting themselves. Alright, I have with me today Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and Marine. Today we're going to be talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to be talking about China inserting themselves in diplomacy.
Okay,
Alright,
so here we
I
go.
have with me today Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and Marine. Today we're going to be talking
And he does have those credentials. We'll leave out the other credentials.
About the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to be talking about China inserting themselves in diplomacy. We're going to be talking about the CIA and several other topics. Scott, thank you so much for being on today's show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I'm going to put your website down below, scottritterextra.com. I'll also put my newsletter and also this month's cash giveaway that my wife and I are doing. But I want to jump right into this. You probably know about this, but new leaked documents this week coming out of Ukraine show Ukraine's generals had planned a middle-of-the-night attack on Moscow to seek revenge on Russia on the one-year anniversary of them invading Ukraine. It took, from what I'm reading,
So let's stop there first. Do you blame them? I mean, your country's in tatters. You're being, your people are being destroyed. They've grabbed 4 of your countries, essentially states or oblasts is what they call the equivalent of states or provinces. What do you think that Ukrainians would want to do? So I don't blame them at all. Now, it might not be the best policy, and I'm glad that the U.S. talked them out of it because there's a better strategy of not creating the ire. You still have the sympathy of the world community if you don't do that. So strategically, I think it was a better idea not to, but do you blame them?
People at the CIA, the State Department, and possibly even the White House going back and forth trying to convince them that this is going to end in nuclear retaliation or World War III. Were you aware of this attack, and what do you think would have been the outcome if Ukraine had launched this attack on Moscow unbeknownst to NATO?
Well, I wasn't aware of the specifics of the attack until the information came out. I can say that monitoring a variety of Ukrainian Telegram channels and things of that nature, that there had been talk about something like this. But I think it's important for people understand for people listening to understand that while we talk about a war in Ukraine, this isn't a war.
Yes, it is. It is very much a war. And if he's going to talk about a special military operation, he's freaking nuts. It's more than that. It's like, I've heard him say this before, and he'd say like, oh, the Russians are just going easy on him. No, they can't do any better. That's the problem.
If it was a war, this conflict would be over already.
But it's not over already because they're just, being kind? Is that it? No, they can't do any better.
Russia's not at war with Ukraine. Russia is seeking a solution that keeps Ukraine from becoming NATO.
So if it wasn't so sad of what's actually going on, it would just be comical that he can actually, with a straight face, say that kind of thing.
War means the destruction of a nation. War means the total defeat of a people. And so I think what the United States and those who intervened were trying to tell the Ukrainians is, if you attack Moscow, there's going to be a war.
There's already a war. Now, they were trying to diffuse it from becoming broader, and I think that's an appropriate strategy because, again, the sympathy of the entire world is with Ukraine being victimized by Russia.
And all of you are going to die. I just want to point that fact out. If this was a war, Zelenskyy would not be alive today.
Well, they did try to kill him, and they were unsuccessful. It is a war, and you're spouting Russian propaganda by refusing to call it what it is. Anywhere else in the world, you would have called it that, except you have to keep restating what Putin says. It's like you're worried that you're going to go to jail in Russia for 25 years because you didn't call it special military operation.
Been killed in week 1, week 2. If this was a war, Kiev would not exist as it currently exists, with a functioning government, infrastructure.
Well, that's thanks to NATO.
Hey, I want you to imagine how it would feel if you got some new beats from me right now, you recorded an amazing song, and then...
Just ask the Iraqis what happened when we went to war against them. The first places we bombed
entirely different scenario.
Palaces, parliament, the functions of government. Leaders became a command and control target, and we hunted them down. So
that's because the Americans were waging that war, not the Russians, who were largely inept at this.
Hussein lived because every day he moved between different targets, different places. We were one step behind him. But I could personally attest, we were trying to kill him. I tried to kill him. One of my missions during the war was to kill Saddam. The Russians are not trying to kill Zelenskyy. They're letting him live. They're letting the Ukrainian government function because their goal is not the destruction of Ukraine. If the Ukrainians carried out this attack, and look, there's others that they're talking about. Right now they're talking about sending drones to attack.
Okay, now this guy is one of the most prized voices on the Russian side of the spectrum of this debate, right? And that's the kind of thing that he's saying. The Russians aren't trying to kill Zelenskyy. If this was a war, it'd all be over now. Now you hear Medvedev and Lavrov and Putin say essentially the same kind of thing. Yeah, it would be. Yeah, we're just being Dmitry Peskov talking about the same thing. We're just, we don't make us escalate.
Victory Parade on March 9th. If they do this, they will die, literally, because Russia's not at war. But if you attack Moscow in the middle of the night on the first year anniversary or on May 9th during the Victory Day Parade, that is an act of war, and Russia will respond in the same. They may not.
So an act of war, like Russia would take hitting the Kerch Bridge as a terrorist event, act of war, whatever. What do you call seizing 4 oblasts on top of Crimea previously and invading with 190,000 troops? That's an act of war. They're already in a state of war from the first hour of the 24th when the invasion began. If one side begins with an act of war, they're in a state of war. It's like he doesn't understand how international it's like he doesn't understand how international law works.
Nuclear weapons. In fact, they won't use nuclear weapons against Kiev, but they will take Kiev off the grid.
It's pronounced Kiev, and no, they won't be using it's pronounced Kiev, and they won't be using nuclear weapons because they're just not that stupid, because there's no upside or no benefit to doing that.
Will no longer exist. And then NATO may get involved, and now we have a nuclear war. So I think that's why, the United States came in and did what they did, because the United States, with all the rhetoric that we have here, we understand that Russia is not putting everything on the line here, that this is still very much a limited military operation.
The only limit is that they're not using nuclear weapons, because they can't, because if they did, they'd be a pariah to all the nations, something like North Korea. Now, out of one side of his mouth, he says the United States is pushing Ukraine, and out of the other side of his mouth, he says the United States talked them down. And the United States did talk them off that ledge, and it was the right thing to do.
Russia. That Russia's goal and objective is not the destruction of the Ukrainian state. If it was, this war would be over.
Okay, so tell that to Anna of Ukraine, who just yesterday was talking about how she's hearing alarm sirens. It could have been her building that was blown up, but yet it was, some people were blown up in their buildings because of an act of war from a neighboring state that killed 3 children, including 10-year-olds. I mean, come on. What do you call that?
The problem for the United States is how do you build up a country like we did with Ukraine, elevate Zelenskyy to be the modern day version of Winston Churchill? I will fight them on the beaches, I will fight them in the shores, I will fight them.
He seems to think that the U.S. just inflated him artificially, rather than that his stature grew because he had the guts to stand up to Russia when everybody looked at it and thought, oh no, he just signed his death warrant. The U.S. didn't have to pump him up.
And then tell him, well, you can't. We're going to pretend you're Winston Churchill, but you can't be Winston.
But restraining him was the right thing, and I think Zelenskyy knows that, because he's wise enough to recognize that he needs the West's support in order to prevail. So I don't know where his argument is here.
Because if you do that, you're going to die. And now Zelensky's looking reality in the face. Ukraine has lost the war, and everybody knows it.
Yeah, see, he keeps saying that.
So Zelensky's
but he
desperate.
said that again and again and again and again, like as if it rains, if you dance long enough, it's going to rain. It's it's bizarre.
For something that can change the algorithm, change the equation. And I think there's a lot of people surrounding him say that the best way we can survive is to bring NATO into the conflict. And the easiest way to bring NATO into conflict is to go to war against Russia. So, but I think I'll leave it with this. Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president,
is an
gave a
idiot.
speech yesterday. And I hope every American watches that speech.
Oh.
Because there's a lot of talk in the United States about the Russians bluffing. You hear it on the media all the time. Oh, Russia's bluffing about nuclear weapons. They're shaking the nuclear saber. But
yeah, and they have done a great job at causing the U.S. to be slow and the West to be slow in providing weapons to that. They have deterred us more than we have deterred them by nuclear saber rattling. And now we see that the sky is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Well, the sky hadn't fallen. And so it's harder and harder for Putin, because his bluff has been called again and again. Don't cross this line with tanks. Don't cross this line with jets. Don't cross this line, right? Okay.
Never going to do it. Russia would never do that. And Medvedev said straight up, he said, look, I'm a former president. I will tell you right now that Russia is a nuclear-armed nation, and the Russian president, and I was this way, must have a steady hand over the nuclear button, willing to push it at any time that it was required to be pushed. And he said, our doctrine clearly states that if somebody carries out operations that represent an existential threat to Russia, we will use nuclear weapons. And you need to understand there will be no hesitancy. No.
And Ukraine is not an existential threat to Russia, except by being a democracy. They're not an existential threat militarily, and if they do that, they'll be a pariah for the nations for the next century.
Warning, no discussion, no debate. We will use them. So anybody who sits there and says, well, let Ukraine do this. Why not? It's a suicide pill.
Yeah, I'm arguing they shouldn't have.
Remember, when Russia uses nuclear weapons, it begins what will always end up as a...
I'm Axel, and I'm one of the AI voices from Revoicer, the first text-to-speech software that is able to show real AI emotions, such as sad or cheerful, friendly or terrified, hopeful or unfriendly, excited or angry.
As a general nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia, and we will all die. So that's why the United States intervenes.
It's not going to happen.
Because I don't think anybody in the United States in a position of power wants to swallow the Ukrainian suicide pill.
But they're not going
that's
to.
What allowed Ukraine to attack Moscow.
But they're not going to. But in the meantime, Putin gets to deter all day long and bully his neighbor all day long because he has nuclear weapons that he's going to saber rattle, and Scott can't seem to see past that.
Okay. Oh, man, interesting. I don't in any way want to defend Putin with what I'm going to say next.
But I'm going to defend Putin with what I'm going to say next.
But just my observation and my logic seems like he is the more steady hand than Medvedev.
Putin is the steady hand.
Good cop and Medvedev.
Now, I'll admit, Medvedev is absolutely bat crazy nuts, right? I mean, he is just out there, and the things that he says and puts on his telegram is absolutely nuts. But it's not like Putin is like some wise old sage.
Or is he just a little bit more wild in his thinking and comments than Putin? Because he's the one that's always like threatening, nuclear war, and Putin's like, okay, hold on, we're just going to keep going with the Russian doctrine.
Look, Medvedev, when he was president, was a very reasonable man. And the reason is, I think the position defines the man. And to be president of Russia is to be president of a world power.
Well, kind of. Second rate, sure.
And Putin is a very steady, stable
economy the size of Texas, sure.
Medvedev has a different job today. And see, Medvedev can say things that Putin can't. Because it's one thing to have the actual president say something. It's another thing to have somebody on the sideline say something. Medvedev, of course, is very influential. He sits on the National Security Council. He's a close advisor of Vladimir Putin. And so when he speaks from a position of authority, but not the ultimate authority.
He's the court gesture.
I think Medvedev's job right now, and I think he's relishing this job, is to be that crazy dog in the background.
Okay, I can agree with him. I'm like, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Yes, his job is to be the crazy one, and he's masterful at being crazy.
That crazy, snarling, foaming, rabid dog. And Putin's the guy holding the dog by the chain, saying, I don't want to let him go. I really don't want to let him go. Don't make me let him go. So that's his job. But I think if, for instance, Medvedev ever again became president, he would revert to more of a Putin style, because it's the job dictates the attitude, and no president would ever behave that way. It's irresponsible. Medvedev is far removed from the nuclear button, therefore he can make these talks. But remember, he is somebody who was president, and he is not going to be saying these things unless he has a green light from the Kremlin.
So that's an interesting insight, that he's saying it intentionally with Putin's backing, and so they know what they're doing. It's propaganda. That's the way it works.
So I think the Russian president enjoys him saying this because it scares the living you-know-what out of people.
Out of some people. It doesn't scare the living you-know-what out of me, but it apparently scares the you-know-what out of him, right? Like, he's worried about this.
No, it does. I mean, even just within the last week, President Lukashenko of Belarus said,
he's another winner.
Everybody should still be very worried about nuclear war.
That's what they want you to believe.
Conflict is not behind any of us. And I didn't know if he was maybe posturing on behalf of Putin since they're buddies, or if he's pointing out a truth that this is still something that could very much go sideways. One mistake, an attack in the middle of the night that NATO doesn't have control over, and next thing you know, we're launching, missiles at each other. Is he backing Putin, or is he telling the truth?
Both. It's both. Look,
is Lukashenko telling the truth?
I mean, I had a conference in my paying job the other day, and I made the reference to the term special military operation.
Lapdog.
And immediately somebody jumped in and said, well, I don't speak Putin.
That's right.
Meaning that simply by using the term special military operation, I was somehow buying into a Russian lexicon.
But you're buying into the Russian narrative that that's all that it is. It's a war. Ask anyone in Ukraine. They'll tell you it's a war.
And therefore supporting Russian propaganda.
You are.
I said, well, that's about the most ignorant thing I've ever heard anybody say, because I'm not speaking Putin either. I'm speaking reality. This was a special military operation, the initial goals and objectives of which were to get Ukraine to the negotiating table, to bring a rapid conclusion to a problem between Ukraine and Russia.
And it failed miserably, didn't it? It was supposed to be taking Kyiv in 3 days and taking the rest of the country in 2 weeks, and it failed. It's an outright war. When you invade with 190,000 and then you gin up another 300,000 in order to continue the war, you're in a war.
And it almost worked. On April 1st, Ukraine was supposed to sit down in Istanbul and sign a peace treaty with Russia. But NATO intervened. And that intervention is everything, because prior to that, this was simply a conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Yes, and Russia could have rolled over NATO. That's true. Or rolled over. Yes, and Russia could have rolled over Ukraine. But NATO's intervention supported Ukraine so that they wouldn't be tyrannized by their neighbor.
And that is not an existential threat to Russia. But when NATO intervenes and turns Ukraine into a proxy of NATO to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia, we have now created a potential existential crisis for Russia.
Not really. So let's reframe that. NATO intervened. Russia could leave Ukraine at any time and the war would be over. Like, that's the reality of it. They could go at any time. That's okay. But is it an existential threat to the existence of the Russian state where they could then use nuclear weapons? No.
And as Medvedev said, existential crisis means we use nuclear weapons to defend ourselves. And that's the statement.
But of course, he's going to have to redefine existential crisis as something more than what an existential crisis actually is in order to do that.
And since May, June of 2022, we have been facing the imminent possibility of a nuclear war, because this war is between NATO and Russia. And that's what Lukashenko is saying. He's saying, even though if you're looking at things, it looks like everything's going okay for Russia right now, what happens if Poland intervenes in Western Ukraine? What happens if
it doesn't look like everything's going okay for Russia?
Embargo Kaliningrad, that Russian enclave on the Baltic Seas.
Yeah, that was a fascinating chapter of that. The Russians went absolutely bad crap mad crazy about Kaliningrad being embargoed or being blocked by the Lithuanians and Poles, when they were trying to capture 4 states, 4 oblasts within Ukraine. So where's the double? That's a double standard by any means, but they can define it how they want if we let them, because you get what you tolerate. So don't tolerate this crap.
These are acts of war.
Yes, it's a war.
Russia engaged in military conflict with a NATO member. Article 5 then kicks in, and now it's a general war between Russia and NATO, not a de facto war, but a real war, and nuclear weapons will be used. So that's what Lukashenko is saying. He's saying, for all those people in Poland that are meeting with the Ukrainians, talking about erasing the border to create a confederation between Ukraine and Poland, thereby allowing Poland to bring troops in, that will be a nuclear conflict. For all those people in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia,
it doesn't have to be a nuclear conflict. By no means. There's no existential threat while things are within Ukraine's borders. The existential threat would come as Russia is being rolled back and into, like, the troops are rolling over the Russian border, rolling back, about to take Moscow. That becomes an existential threat. But while they're in Ukraine's borders, there's nothing of the sorts. This guy's freaking nuts, and all he's doing is repeating Russian propaganda that's going to allow them to get everything that they want. Look, it's the same kind of thing. Like, somebody was talking about this just the other day of, well, Ukraine's going to have to give up some ground. Why? Why isn't Ukraine saying, I want a 100-mile buffer zone around Ukraine after this war is done, so that it's depopulated and Russia can't get anywhere near us, right? But they're not. But only Russia can benefit from whatever peace talk we're talking about right now, which is why it has to go the distance until there's a battlefield victory in order to resolve the conflict.
You can embargo Kaliningrad to punish Russia. That will be a nuclear conflict. That the threat of nuclear war is very real. Remember, he's the president of Belarus, who has now been empowered by Russia on July.
Or a puppet of Russia. That's actually the way that you should think of Lukashenko.
Russia will be storing nuclear weapons on Belarus soil,
which I believe is a violation, and that's funny for an arms inspector to be talking about.
That are going to be turned over to Belarus Air Force and missile forces in case of a war. So Lukashenko is speaking as a potential nuclear leader. So everybody should listen to what he's saying. He's not threatening anybody.
Yes,
he's
he
just
is.
Stating a straight up fact.
He has threatened
things
people.
Can still go, as you said, sideways. And if they go sideways, nuclear weapons are very much on the table. So I say this not because I want to fearmonger or be seen as supporting Russian policy.
Though I am fearmongering and supporting Russian policy.
I say this as an American who doesn't want to die.
Me too. I'm an American who doesn't want to die. And the way that you deal with this is not to do what he's saying. What he's saying is absolutely the wrong policy.
And I would hope that everybody listening to this understands that that's what we're talking about. This isn't a game. This is reality.
Yep.
And for Russia, it's life and death reality, just as if...
No, for Ukrainians, it's a life and death reality. The Russians can go home at any time that they choose.
The Russian army was in Mexico threatening to empower insurgents in America to strip away Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Maybe even take Colorado and Utah while you're at it. Just carve away all of those former Spanish territories, former Mexican territories, and bring them in. We would view that as an existential threat.
He just made the case for Ukraine. Ukraine has the existential threat. It's Russia stealing Ukrainian territory. That's the scenario he just created. That's absolutely amazing.
And we would use every weapon necessary to...
As the Ukrainians are.
...prevent that from happening, to include nuclear weapons.
If they only had them. But you know what happened? During the 90s, the Budapest Memorandum, the Ukrainians gave away their nuclear weapons, and they were promised by the US, the UK, and Russia to respect their borders and guarantee their borders. And Russia's the aggressor.
Russia is right now, and they're not playing games.
Yeah. You know, I bring this stuff up because I read this, but then I go to like CNN and MSNBC.
Oh, here we
and
go.
ABC News. They're not talking about the warnings from Lukashenko. They're not talking about the warnings from Medvedev, and that's why I bring these up. And sometimes people are like, well, you're making this stuff up because I'm not seeing it in the mainstream media. But you know, trusting the mainstream media is typically not the best thing to do. So
okay, so I talked about this just a couple of days ago, where I was talking about why, like, conservatives particularly tend away from the mainstream media because of the liberal bias, but they're missing the point. At least there's some journalistic standards, as opposed to what? Some guy on YouTube or Russian media, Russian state media, that's going to be reliable? What's the alternative?
I appreciate your insight on that.
Did you see Tucker Carlson's most recent interview after he left Fox?
Possibly. I've watched several things trying to understand, but tell me what it is, and then I'll tell you if I know what you're saying.
It was just he was doing a podcast. It was a young kid. I think he referred to his age as 28.
Okay.
But the interesting thing, the only reason I bring it up is that he said one of the greatest insights is is that the media is not here to tell you the truth. The media is here to shape things. They lie, they distort, and so the reason why I brought that up is to reinforce what you were saying. When you watch CNN, when you watch MSNBC, when you watch Fox News, when you watch anything, ABC, NBC, CBS, understand they're not there to tell you the truth. They are there to shape a perception. They are there to promulgate a policy position that's not about the truth, but about what we want you to do.
Okay, so a broken clock is worth right twice a day, and there's a second time. I would agree with that you have to triangulate on your sources in order to get the truth. But when you triangulate on sources, you have to triangulate on verifiable sources, not on sketchy sources, some guy speaking on YouTube that's not showing why he's saying what he's saying, some Telegram channel or Twitter account, or God forbid Russian propaganda state media.
And so it's very likely when you look at something as controversial as Ukraine that you're not going to get the truth from mainstream media. And this is why it's important to dig deeper. And that's why I hope people are grateful for what you're doing, because you are providing them with analysis and information that they wouldn't be getting from mainstream media, but they should be getting from mainstream media.
Yeah. Okay, now that you explain it, I did see that.
So what's the alternative? Well, you can watch someone like Stephen Gardner with 1.26 million subscribers, and then they can watch this video with 214,000 views in 23 hours. That's the alternative that they're providing. It's not much of an alternative.
I didn't personally watch Tucker Carlson on Fox News, but with him being fired, I've been, digging into him a little bit more, and yeah, he said that he was kind of embarrassed to be in his 50s, and it hadn't dawned on him that he was part of the government mouthpiece, putting out narrative versus putting out truth. I thought that was pretty a sign of humility to recognize that.
So then he went to a different place, and I like some of the things that he said, but on Russia and Ukraine, he was dead wrong, absolutely dead wrong. And he was cited on RT over 300 times. And after he was fired, RT offered him a job, at least tongue-in-cheek. They put it into a tweet, hey, if you want to be able to question more, come work for RT. So there's that.
Some of that is, your sponsors dictate what you're able to talk about. We saw that during COVID. We see that during wartime.
We see that during Russian state media sponsoring what you're able to talk about.
Situations. Okay, Colonel Douglas Macgregor has said that this war has moved from a special operation to a humanitarian crisis.
They forgot the whole war part.
And that the American people don't fully understand how awful this war is every day. The trenches, this is as bad as World War I and World War II.
It's time for me to get set up for therapy, and I use this room as my office. But the desk is over here, and so when I'm seated at the desk, this is the background. I have my therapy session, which is virtual, and
the Ukrainian people are being slaughtered, and we don't, we're mad that our tax money is going to them versus helping the homeless or whatever, but their reality is that they are being wiped out as a nation. What are your thoughts on him?
Notice the assumptions. Just Ukrainians are being slaughtered, nothing about the Russians that are in the meat grinder as well. And it's set up between the slaughter of these poor Ukrainians who don't deserve to be slaughtered, and so sad, and they're only being slaughtered because we're propping them up, as opposed to poor people in our country. Notice that juxtaposition. This is what the Russian-leaning conservative, I don't want to say conservatives because they're not really conservatives, mostly populists, tend to say. That's the way that they set, it's either this or that, and they assume that the Russians aren't getting their heads handed to them in the process.
Saying that this has now become a humanitarian crisis for Ukraine.
Sure, I can buy that.
Again, I'll preface this by saying that Colonel Macgregor is one of the few sane voices out there.
Yeah, if you think that McGregor is a sound or voice of wisdom on this, yeah, you've got bigger
And every
problems.
time he speaks, there's that old commercial when I forget the name of the company, but when so and so speaks, everybody listens.
That's E.F.
When Colonel
Hutton.
McGregor speaks, everybody should listen.
No,
Because,
no.
he is very, very balanced, and I have to second what he's saying. I mean, it is a humanitarian. We're watching the death of a nation, literally the death of a nation. But more than that, we're watching the death of a people. I don't mean
That's true.
individuals.
I mean,
the
there is
Ukrainian
an
people.
intentional genocide.
If the casualty figures are remotely correct, and I believe they are, over 300,000 Ukrainian men had died.
Okay, that casualty figure is not anywhere near remotely correct. So, but what the Russians are trying to do is genocide. So he's right that that's the intent.
Right? That's a genetic pool that is gone, removed. I don't want to get into too much, but understand that we all know where we came from, and it wasn't storks. Okay, and it requires a man and a woman in union to produce children.
3 times a day.
And the Ukrainians
Third
are
time.
losing their men. They're being slaughtered. And again, I don't want to get into too much Darwinism here, but some of the best examples of Ukrainian men, the most healthy, most physically fit, manly men, are dying. And so what's left is not that.
This is a
What's
terrible
left is
argument.
something different, which is going to change the way Ukraine moves forward as a nation. This is wrong.
This is a terrible argument because he's assuming casualty figures that are way out of proportion. Like, if go back, like, I guess it was like 10 videos ago, something like that, where I did Scott Ritter before with a judge, and he was talking about that 7-to-1 figure that is now debunked, and it looks like it came from perhaps the Donbass Davushka or some other means of making the figures look funny, but he was defending that 7 Ukrainians died for every Russian, and that's absolutely crazy.
This is just and most Americans don't get it. They're being slaughtered. It's not a fair fight.
That's what he's talking about, that 7-to-1
kind
of thing.
Colin Powell famously said, "I don't believe in a fair fight."
That's correct.
My job isn't to have a fair fight. My job is to kill you. And that's what the Russians are doing right now. They have.
That's not correct.
Over the course of the last several months, changed the entire dynamic of this war zone. Ukrainian air defense almost doesn't exist anymore. And by removing air defense on the front line, the Russian Air Force is now freer to attack targets using weapons they previously couldn't do. Ukrainian weapons that were given to them by the United States designed to equalize the battlefield no longer work because the Russians are very smart, very adaptive. They jam the GPS signals. And so Ukraine.
Are you talking about drones? Because that's about the only thing that they've been able to jam. Everything else seems to work, and Russia is low on artillery at the same time. Their jets are loath to get into Ukrainian airspace. So, are we watching the same war?
Aren't able to do to the Russians what the Russians are doing to them in increasing numbers. And the Russians are gradually getting angry. And what I mean by that is their capacity to kill is greater. Whereas during the Battle of
where has it been? If that's the case, where has it been? They've been infighting between themselves, between Wagner and the actual military, and they've been showing forth very poor. If they actually can do more, they've not been showing it. So, but when you hear him talk, it's like he's got a crush on the Russians.
Pool. The Russians did not habitually drop entire apartment buildings. They would actually send their troops in who would fight 4 by 4 by 4 to take the building. Very bloody.
And then they chickened out and used artillery.
And then they, give the people in the basement a chance to surrender. Now the Russians
that wasn't the reason.
The Ukrainians have turned an apartment block into a fortified zone. They pull back and they drop a 1,500-pound bomb on it and drop the whole building.
If they can get close enough, they try to do that.
They're doing that over and over again. The Ukrainians used to be able to assemble troops about 15 kilometers behind the front line, concentrate them before sending them in to fight as a coherent force. Now, as they assemble them, the Russians are detecting it, and they're dropping the 1,500-pound bomb right upon those troops, killing everybody.
Yeah, there's not really a
Ukrainians
lot
can't
of
outspeed their
evidence that
forces.
that's kind of going
Their
on.
artillery is being destroyed piecemeal by drones that are operating freely without any interference. And the Ukrainians are running out of artillery ammunition, so they can't even defend their troops in the trenches. And
As are the
trench warfare
Russians.
Is hell, excuse my language. It is a living hell. This war, I mean, war is, again, Tecumseh Sherman said it, war is hell. I forget, there was another general that said, thank goodness the war is so bad as it is because we grow to love it. Yeah, maybe Ulysses Grant said that, but this is all true. We know this, but this is a special kind of hell. This is Dante's Inferno 20 times over.
That's what watching this video feels like, some kind of special Dante's Inferno.
For the Ukrainian soldiers. And to be blunt, we're to blame. The American people are to blame.
Nope.
Because
to be blunt, Russia's to blame. Putin's to blame. Nobody's to blame except Putin. He could have stayed on his side of the fence. He didn't have to cross over. There was no, and like you couldn't make the argument that, well, they were going to join NATO. They couldn't have joined NATO while there was a conflict within their borders already. So that's a moot argument. So that's lying.
Have allowed our government to create this situation. This war is happening because of American policies. Only because of American policies.
So it's America to blame, not Putin. Did you hear that? That's what he's saying.
We have poured so much money and so much material into this war. We've kept it going longer than it naturally should have. This war.
What he means by that is that the Russians should have won by now, but the United States and West have artificially kept it going. So we should have let the Russians just grab that territory and be gone with it. That's what he was saying.
Have been over a long time ago. Ukraine was never going to win this war. Russia was always going to win this war. What we've done.
I wonder if he's going to say, I don't know what happened, or I was wrong after he was wrong at the end.
Prolonged this conflict, ensuring that hundreds of thousands of more Ukrainians die, tens of millions of Ukrainians are displaced, homes are destroyed, cities are destroyed, towns are destroyed.
But it's not the fault of the West.
And all the while,
it's Putin's
we're
fault.
Balancing on the precipice of a nuclear conflict that could put us at risk as well. But McGregor is 100% correct. This is a humanitarian disaster, and the best thing we could do is bring an end to it. Easiest way to end this war is to cut off the supplies to Ukraine and force them to go to the negotiating table.
Which what he's saying is the easiest way to let Russia win, because he's got a man-boy crush on Putin.
They're on life support right now, and all we're doing is pumping, artificially, stimulated life to a body that shouldn't be alive. We need to unplug it, get it done, and let Ukraine move on and try and recover.
But they can't move on. See, that's the thing. Ukraine has the existential threat, and you say it so cavalierly, as if you get to decide Ukraine's fate. What's wrong with you?
As they can.
Do you think Volodymyr Zelenskyy had NATO's permission to reach out to China to try to broker peace, or is he seeing the writing on the wall and he's like, NATO's just going to keep encouraging us to fight and send weapons. We need to end this. We've got to turn to China. Where do you think this phone call came from?
I'm pretty sure he's not thinking that at all.
Permission, no permission, desperation.
Well, first of all, you can't pick up a phone and call somebody if they haven't given you the number. So I think we have to start with the fact that what we're seeing here isn't Ukrainian diplomacy; it's Chinese diplomacy.
Well,
and I think
perhaps.
we both know Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, a very good man. And Ray has repeatedly lambasted the fact that where is American diplomacy? I mean, why isn't Zelenskyy calling Washington, D.C. to bring an end to this war?
Because he doesn't want to end the war. He wants to win the war. There's a difference between sacrificing 4 of your oblasts and prematurely ending the war that way, or winning it. He wants to win it. It's pretty easy.
Because we're not in the business of ending the war.
No, we're in the business of justice.
Apparently discovered the secret diplomatic sauce. They went into the Middle East and They did something that nobody even thought about, which was to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran together and create peace. China's working with Russia to bring the Saudis to Syria and bring an end to that conflict. Peace is breaking out all over and has a Chinese accent to it. And so China now has come in. They had, Xi Jinping flew to Moscow, had that 3-day meeting.
Peace is breaking out all over.
Putin. And before that, they put out a 12-point peace plan.
Okay, the Chinese meeting with Putin. Putin got nothing. Like nothing. Putin was saying like, we're gonna have this multipolar world, and China's like, we'll work with you on things together. There's no limits to our friendship, but didn't say anything about anything that he was going to do with them. Nothing concrete, and Putin didn't like that. Before that, the 12 points. The 12 points didn't actually say anything either, and they kind of slanted toward Russia.
And everybody's like, well, that's not going to work. That's not the point. Diplomacy is never solved by the first piece of paper put on the table. Anybody who's ever been involved in negotiation understands that that's simply a starting point that begins a dialogue that ends with something that is achievable. So the Chinese put something on the table that nobody else was. Where was the American 12-point plan? Where's the European 12-point plan? They don't exist. China put it on the table and forced people to look at it.
It's a 1-point plan. Beat Russia.
And now Zelenskyy, again, looking at reality, Zelenskyy is realizing that there's nothing the West can do now to save him. They're out of everything. And the Russians are getting everything. And their only hope now is to find a negotiated settlement. I think that he believes the Chinese have more leverage over the Russians than they actually do. Because China has said, we're not here to dictate outcomes.
So if you look at my previous video where I was talking about Xi's 10 potential things that he could do this or that or the other thing or the other thing or the other thing. Yeah, they could be legitimately negotiating. I don't see it, but go and look at that video and you'll see what Xi can or can't do, what his menu of options are.
And it's not going to put pressure on Russia. But what China will do, I believe, is promise Zelenskyy that the best he can hope for is to rebuild what he retained. Meaning the territories that he's lost, he's not going to get back. But if you expect Europe and the United States to
So, and that's the difference between he and I. He believes that, no, they shouldn't get it back. It's not really a big deal. He's not going to get it back. It's unrealistic. I think he's going to get it back.
Build your destroyed nation, you are waiting in vain. They've already put $200 billion into you. They're not going to put any more. When this war is done, they're done.
When this war is done, Russia will be repaying before it can get back into good graces with the rest of the world.
So China is your only savior, and I think what the Chinese are saying is,
no,
bring an end to this conflict on terms that Russia will accept, and we will work to rebuild your country. We will work with you to rebuild your country. But if you don't make peace on terms that Russia can accept, you'll be left to your own devices, and it's going to take a little bit of time for this to percolate.
I don't think that's
with Zelenskyy.
I don't think that's actually what the conversation was from anything I could detect, and I read a bunch of articles about that just today.
But ultimately, that's his only viable option.
No.
Out. And again, I know there's some people out there that get frustrated because China's doing this, China's doing that, but they're only able to do it because there's no competitor. Where's American diplomacy? All week.
It's called arming them so that they can win.
Bring to the table is war, 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 war. China's coming in and saying, well, look, the best thing is for us to have economic relations. We mutually benefit. We both get, growing economies. Peace is breaking out all over. And enough people in the world are just tired of decade after decade after decade.
Peace is breaking out all over.
We in America don't know war. We think we know war, but we don't know war. We live in a wonderfully prosperous nation that's been free of the death and destruction that large-scale war brings. The rest of the world, however, they know war firsthand, and they're exhausted by it. And because America's not providing that alternative, that diplomatic solution, all we offer is more war. China is able to come in, and look what they're doing. I mean, how can you argue against, let's remove the Chinese accent from it. How can you argue against peace?
Because it's not peace when your neighbor comes in, steals 20% of your land, and then says we want peace. If somebody came into my house, robbed my family, took one of my kids, and then said, hey, let's just have a truce now, I wouldn't be having a truce. I'd fight him like a freaking banshee. There's no excuse. That's not okay.
You can't.
I can.
Yeah, there's been this vacuum created, and I don't know, I don't want to become political. I know that you have your own thoughts or whatever, but it does seem that the Biden administration doesn't want to do diplomacy, or maybe they're not good at it. I don't know, but America used to be known for being good diplomats, and now it's like they just hang up the phone. They don't want the communication happening.
Nixon went to China.
It's as if this is America's fault, not Putin's fault. Put the blame where the blame belongs. Only one person was responsible for this whole thing, and that's Putin making a decision to cross the border. Oh, but America caused it. How did America cause it? By inviting Ukraine into NATO. Ukraine couldn't have gotten into NATO. In fact, the only reason that we're in this war right now is because Ukraine's not in NATO. So there's that.
Trump went to North Korea. But where's Biden going? And again, I'm not going to get political. I respect that. I'm not here to score political points, but where we need, and I think the problem here is that the world has changed since Richard.
So if North Korea had invaded South Korea, would we be saying, hey, we know that you took 20% of South Korea's land, but let's just have peace? Would we be doing that? I don't think that's the right answer.
Went to China. The world has even changed since Donald Trump went to North Korea. We're in a situation right now where the United States is in retrograde. The American empire is falling down. The dollar is not strong. People are dumping the dollar, going for other alternative currencies. There's this BRICS economic forum.
And this is RT through and through. Russian state media talking about this all day long, trying to get away from the dollar-denominated currency to rubles or yuan or something else. It's not going to work very well.
Standing up and challenging the G7. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is challenging the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Europe. And the Biden administration seems to be locked in the past. If you read their foreign policies, they talked about the importance of sustaining the rules-based international order, which of course is something created after the war. But the war's been over for 8 decades now.
RT, incidentally, loves railing against the rules-based international order in favor of whatever Russia and the BRICS might come up with as a multipolar alternative. They love railing against it. Look it up in RT. You'll see multiple sites.
It's changing, and the Biden administration seems to be slow about adapting to new realities.
So let me ask, if you remove the rules-based international order where one country isn't knocking over another country like we just did, what happens? Well, then it becomes survival of the fittest, and might makes right. And Xi gets to knock over Taiwan with impunity, and all kinds of bad things come out of that. That's the way to get to nuclear exchange, not what he's been explaining here.
The best thing you can do is get ahead of this change and seek to impose your vision, your face, your fingerprints on whatever this change is going to be. But we're not doing that. We're back here trying to slow down the change. The Chinese are the ones getting ahead of it, putting their fingerprint on it.
Yeah. Well, maybe the White House doesn't want Biden going out and talking to
So the Chinese are trying to position himself to benefit from whichever side wins. That's what the Chinese are doing right now. Talked about that just the other day.
people. They barely even let the press ask him questions here in the United States. So thank you so much, Scott. This has been a great discussion. I'm going to put your website, scottritterextra.com.
It's not been a great discussion. It's painful. And if you're still with me at this point, you deserve a gold medal. Put the term gold medal in the comments so that I know that you've gotten this far. You are awesome if you have. Thank you for your time. Thank you for caring for Ukraine. Go get yourself an aspirin.